In January 2023, the last Boeing 747 ever built rolled off the assembly line in Everett, Washington. The workers who built it signed their names on the fuselage. Some of them cried, and the aviation world watched, knowing it was the end of something that would never come back. Then, Lufthansa's CEO walked onto that stage and said something nobody expected. They weren't retiring their 747s. They were keeping them flying into the 2030s, and they were actively investing to make that happen. The room didn't know how to react, because this wasn't just an unusual decision. It was a decision that contradicted everything the aviation industry had spent the last 20 years learning. Of the more than 70 airlines that once flew passenger 747s, virtually all of them had already moved on. Korean Air and Air China, the only two other carriers still operating them, had both announced retirement plans before the decade was out, and for good reason. The math on a four-engine jet in a world of fuel-efficient twins simply doesn't work. Everyone agreed on that. It was settled. Except Lufthansa didn't just disagree. In 2025, they increased 747 operations by 32%. And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because Germany has some of the most aggressive climate commitments in Europe. Fuel prices across the continent had surged following the tensions with Russia. The entire industry was in a race toward efficiency, toward lighter, toward fewer engines, toward less burn per seat. Lufthansa went the other direction. So the question isn't just whether this was a smart move. The question is how a decision this controversial could also be this calculated. Because when you look closely at what Lufthansa actually built around this aircraft, not just the plane itself, but everything surrounding it, you start to realize something unsettling. This might not be reckless at all, but to understand why, you first need to understand how badly the 747 had already fallen. Back in the 1970s and 80s, four-engine aircraft ruled long-haul aviation. The logic was simple. More engines meant more safety over open ocean. Regulators required it. Airlines had no choice, and the 747 sat at the top of that world. The largest, the longest-ranged, the most iconic commercial aircraft ever built. At its peak, it was the best-selling widebody on the planet. That upper deck alone made it recognizable to anyone who had ever been near an airport. Then the rules changed. Extended range twin engine operational performance standards was a regulatory framework that had existed for decades, but as it matured and expanded, it quietly dismantled the four-engine jet's last remaining advantage. Suddenly, twin-engine aircraft could fly the same transoceanic routes that had belonged exclusively to jets like the 747, and the new twins arriving at the same time. The Boeing 777, the Airbus A330, were not just capable, they were better, more efficient, cheaper to operate, easier to fill. Airlines are businesses running on margins that would make most industries uncomfortable. When a twin-engine jet can fly the same route for less money, the decision isn't difficult. It's inevitable. Boeing saw what was happening and tried to respond. In 2005, they launched the 747-8, a modernized variant with new engines, redesigned wings, updated avionics, a genuine attempt to make the aircraft competitive again. The industry response was devastating. Over its entire production run, the passenger version of the 747-8 attracted just 42 orders worldwide. Against Boeing's projections, that number was catastrophic. One airline accounted for nearly half of those orders. Lufthansa purchased 19 of them, became the launch customer, staked its long-haul future on a jet the rest of the world had already given up on. And at the time, plenty of people inside aviation thought that was a mistake. What those people didn't know was what Lufthansa had actually paid for them. Here's something the aviation industry doesn't talk about enough. The price on the tag and the price on the contract are almost never the same thing. Boeing's list price for the 747-8 exceeded $400 million per aircraft. That's the number that gets quoted. That's what most airlines would pay after standard negotiations. But Lufthansa had something most airlines don't. 50 years of history with this aircraft. A relationship that started in 1970, when they became the first European carrier to fly the 747 and launch customer status on the 747 sampai 8 program which Boeing desperately needed to keep alive. That leverage was worth something extraordinary. Lufthansa secured their fleet of 19 aircraft for approximately $3.2 billion total. Do the math. That's roughly $170 million per jet, not $400 million. $170 million. For context, a new Airbus A350 today commands approximately $350 million even with volume discounts. The aircraft that was supposed to make the 747 obsolete costs more than twice what Lufthansa paid for the plane it was replacing. And this is the moment where the whole story shifts, because the aviation industry defaults to one measurement when comparing aircraft economics: fuel burn, liters per seat per kilometer. It's a clean, simple number, and it makes the 747 look terrible. For engines, massive fuel consumption, case closed. But fuel burn only tells part of the story. The part it ignores is the capital cost, the debt payments, the depreciation, the ownership burden that sits on an airline's balance sheet every single month, regardless of whether that aircraft ever leaves the ground. When you bought your aircraft at half the price of the competition, that burden looks completely different. The fuel disadvantage that kills the economics for every other operator doesn't kill them for Lufthansa, because Lufthansa started from a position no other airline could reach. But that was only the beginning of the advantage. And this is where it matters that you understand what happened next, because the acquisition price alone doesn't explain the full picture, not even close. There's a part of Lufthansa that most people outside the industry have never heard of. It's called Lufthansa Technik, and it is one of the largest aviation maintenance organizations on the planet. Lufthansa Technik operates facilities across Germany, the United States, and China. It doesn't just maintain Lufthansa's own fleet, it services dozens of carriers worldwide. It is, in effect, a global business unto itself, one that happens to sit inside an airline holding company. In commercial aviation, maintenance is the second largest cost after the aircraft itself, and for a four-engine jet, that cost is substantially higher than for a twin. More engines mean more overhauls, more components, more hours on the ground. For most airlines that tried to operate the 747, maintenance was the cost that eventually broke the business case. Lufthansa Technik changes that equation in two specific ways. The first is institutional knowledge. Lufthansa Technik has been maintaining 747s for over 50 years. That depth of expertise means faster turnarounds, optimized procedures, and less time with the aircraft sitting idle. When a Lufthansa 747 needs service, it gets back in the air faster than it would at almost any other facility on Earth. The second is scale. When you're servicing dozens of airlines simultaneously, you buy parts in volumes that smaller operations cannot access. The pricing you can negotiate with suppliers at that scale is simply not available to anyone else. That bulk purchasing power turns a cost center into a competitive weapon. So Lufthansa is operating an aircraft with a higher maintenance burden than modern alternatives. But they're doing it at a cost structure that those alternatives cannot touch, because they own the infrastructure that makes it possible. And here's what that means in practice. The three factors that should make the 747 economically impossible for any modern airline acquisition cost: fuel burn and maintenance. Lufthansa has systematically neutralized all three, which brings us to the part of the story that actually generates the money. There is a number in commercial aviation that reshapes how you think about the entire industry once you understand it. Premium passengers, business class, first class can account for as much as 75% of a flight's total revenue while occupying a fraction of its physical space. A single first-class seat from Frankfurt to New York might generate $8,000. The economy seat next to the window in row 47 generates $400. Both burn the same fuel to get across the Atlantic. This is the arithmetic that modern aviation is reorganizing itself around. Airlines worldwide are shrinking economy cabins and expanding premium sections. The future of profitability in long-haul aviation is not volume, it is yield, and Lufthansa sits in a position to capture that yield that no other European carrier can match. Germany is Europe's largest economy, over $4 trillion in GDP annually, the world's third largest exporter. The corporate travel demand flowing out of Frankfurt is not just significant, it is structural. It doesn't disappear in a downturn the way leisure travel does. It is tied to the flow of global commerce, and Germany is at the center of that flow. Lufthansa, as Germany's flag carrier, commands a disproportionate share of that high-yield traffic. The executives, the consultants, the dealmakers flying between Frankfurt and Chicago, Delhi, Singapore, New York, these are passengers who will pay for a better seat, and they fly often enough to know exactly what a better seat feels like. This is where the 747's physical architecture stops being a liability and becomes an asset. Boeing's own specifications suggest the 747-8 can seat up to 467 passengers in a standard 3-class configuration. Lufthansa's version carries 364. That deliberate reduction isn't inefficiency,